My name is Stephen Carbo, and I work with the democracy program here at Demos. I suspect that we have a number of new faces here, so first of all, another welcome, and then let me say a few things about my organization. We are a national nonprofit organization. We're a research and advocacy organization, and we focus on primarily on four overarching goals for the nation and for our world, which is a more equitable economy with widely shared prosperity and opportunity, a vibrant and inclusive democracy with high levels of voting and civic participation, an empowered public sector that works for the common good, and a responsible U.S. engagement in an interdependent world. And one of the things that we do here at Demos regularly is hold events and discussions like these with very important topics, such as we'll discuss today, the U.S. and European perspectives on immigration, a problem or an opportunity. A couple reminders: we are being taped today, so just keep that in mind. The restrooms are over on the other side of this corridor. And I did want to take a moment just to introduce Miles Rappaport, who is the president of Demos. At least recognize Miles. Miles, want to... we have a moderator, I'm sorry, Bill Droziak will moderate the discussion. I think we're going to go until around 2 o'clock. And I want to thank the American Council on Germany, the German Marshall Fund for the United States, the World Policy Institute, and for sponsoring this event today, and a special thanks for the number of staff who were able to pull it together and make sure that it runs smoothly, as these events always do. Thank you. Bill?
Okay. Thank you very much. And it's a pleasure as President of the American Council on Germany to welcome you all here today to discuss a fascinating and important subject of great relevance to the transatlantic relationship. First of all, I want to thank our friends and partners at Demos, the German Marshall Fund, and the World Policy Institute. I think it's great that we can convene these events at different locales in New York, particularly among institutions that share an interest in such an important subject as immigration. We have tried, at the American Council on Germany, have tried to find ways in which the United States and Europe can learn from each other in terms of best practices. The United States, being an immigrant country, of course, has a lot of experience in this regard, and Germany, as well as other European countries, are rapidly learning that they too need to adjust to the fact that of the 21st century that they are becoming immigrant countries. We see a lot of evidence that there is some healthy change as well as some difficult transition. But just in Germany, if you look now, the new German health minister in the current government is actually was a Vietnamese orphan who was adopted by German parents and has now become a rising star in the political scene, named Philipp Rösler. We have the first German of Turkish descent, Cem Özdemir, one of our former young leaders, who is chairman of a major German political party, the Greens, and we hope that this trend, a healthy trend, will continue in dealing with the myriad challenges that European countries face, both in terms of the new immigrants and also of integrating these minorities into their societies. So we're delighted today to have with us Delancey Gusten, who is the head of the Immigration and Integration Program at the German Marshall Fund. And she will present the results of the latest Transatlantic Trends Survey, which looks at these developments in, I guess, 6 West European countries, and interviewing about 1,000 people each. And so I think this is my experience, having been somebody who worked at the German Marshall Fund and helping set up their Brussels office, found that these surveys are extremely valuable, both for researchers, scholars, and journalists in detecting the transit work here. So we'll hear from Delancey, who will speak for about 25 minutes, give you the results of the latest survey, the second of I guess, that will, which will become a regular feature of GMF's work. And then we'll ask another former young leader of ours, Michelle Wilker, the executive director of the World Policy Institute, to give her impressions of the results, and then we'll have a bit of an exchange, and I'll open it up for questions. So with that, Delancey, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Bill. Thanks, you all, for coming. And I'd just like to also echo the thanks to Demos for hosting us here, and for the World Policy Institute and the American Council on Germany for allowing us to share these findings with you. Of course, we're based in Washington, where our headquarters are, and so it's nice to be able to reach out to other communities in the United States. Just a little bit of background about this survey. It's called Transatlantic Trends Immigration. Of course, this is only focusing on immigration and integration issues, a very narrow subject, though it follows in the tradition of a foreign policy survey that GMF has conducted for about 8 years. We've conducted this survey in European, Western, and Eastern European countries and the United States for 8 years, focusing on issues like NATO, on cooperation transatlantically, on things like China, Afghanistan, Iran, and that is a survey that always comes out in September, and which the American Council on Germany has also helped us to roll out in the past in September or October. So look for that later this year. Now, following the successful steps of that foreign policy survey, we did decide to look at a very specific issue, and that is immigration. That is, of course, of interest to both North Americans and to Europeans who are experiencing large flows of immigrants to their countries and are dealing with the integration implications of that. Let me just say we do this survey in cooperation with a number of partners. First, the Bradley Foundation, which is based in Milwaukee, the Compagnia di San Paolo, which is based in Turin, Italy, the Barrow-Cadbury Trust in London, UK, and with additional support from the Fundación BBVA in Spain. Just a quick word about methodology. I'd be happy to answer any methodological questions during the question and answer session, but just to give you a brief overview, in this survey we have 8 countries. It's the United States, Canada, and 6 European countries, the UK, France, Italy, Germany, Spain, and the Netherlands. You'll notice in the graphs that I'm about to show you that Spain and Canada are new countries. So unfortunately, they don't have data from 2008, which is the first year that we did this study, but we were able to study them this year. We surveyed 1,000 people per country using random digit dialing on telephone interviews. And the survey was conducted, or the polling was conducted between September 1st and September 17th of last year. Just to give you a brief overview of what I'll be discussing, the economic crisis. We surveyed people for the first time in the first 2 weeks of September 2008. And as many of you might recall, AIG fell on September 17th. So we really were able to poll people before the economic crisis, the financial crisis started to snowball, and people really started to feel the hurt of the global recession, as it turned out to be. So we now have data from before and during, or after the economic crisis, depending on how optimistic you are. I'll also go into the gap between the perception of immigration and the reality of the situation in these various countries. I'll also touch on legal versus illegal immigration, the perceptions of these phenomena, and also the different immigrant groups. I will go through immigration policy preferences. So this is really the meat of immigration management to these different countries, as well as immigrant integration preferences for those policies. We asked a couple of questions this year about governments, how they're currently faring with immigration management, and also who should be making immigration policy decisions. The last thing that I'll focus on just briefly is climate-induced migration or environmental migration, a topic that the German Marshall Fund has started to look at in the past couple of months. So without further ado, the first question that we asked in our survey was, what do you think is the most important issue facing your country today? And not surprisingly, in all countries, we had big pluralities or majorities saying that the economy was the most important issue. This is something that they chose out of a host of different issues that they could have cited. And immigration seems to be fairly low on the list of priorities. Yes?
Also, people are very concerned about healthcare. We have no healthcare.
Definitely, and that was on the list as well, but I'll take questions at the end if that's all right. But in 2 countries, we saw almost a fifth of people saying that actually immigration was the most important issue facing their country, and this was the UK and Italy. So another question that we asked to just get at people's general perceptions of immigration, we asked, well, do you think that this is more of a, that immigration is more of a problem or more of an opportunity for your country? And what we found is that last year we had some mixed results across countries. But this year we saw an uptick in people saying that immigration was more of a problem for their country versus 2008. So this is particularly of note in the Netherlands, where there's a 9 percentage point jump. And now the UK, where there was always a lot of skepticism about immigration, we now have 2/3 of respondents saying that immigration is more of a problem for their country rather than an opportunity. As you can see on the very left-hand side of the screen, Canada is a huge outlier here, with only 25% of the respondents saying that immigration was a problem, so they are very optimistic about immigration to their country. Considering that we thought maybe this uptick in people saying that immigration is more of a problem is due to the economic crisis. So we asked a number of questions this year that would kind of target the perceptions of how immigrants affect labor markets and other things about society. So particularly labor markets, we asked, do you think that immigrants in general help to fill labor shortages where there are no native-born citizens to fill those jobs? And we found that on both continents that people agree with the statement that they help to fill shortages. Do they create jobs as immigrants set up new businesses? Of course, this is kind of getting at the issue of immigrant entrepreneurship. And we found that Canadians are very optimistic about this, with about 3/4 saying that immigrants create jobs. But also in the United States, we found a lot of people saying that they do create jobs as they set up new businesses. Then, of course, we asked, do you think that immigrants take jobs away from native-born workers? And what we found is that Americans are by far the most likely to say that immigrants take jobs away from native-born workers. So this is kind of a nuanced vision here of creating jobs, taking them away. And Americans are also very skeptical or very pessimistic about the wage effects of immigration. So they say that, yes, or a big plurality of them say that immigrants do bring down the wages of citizens. Despite this, the effects or the perceptions of how immigrants affect the labor market, we actually saw similar numbers last year to those questions that we asked. And so we tried to see if there was anything that we could prove that the economic crisis was something that had affected people's attitudes towards immigration. And actually the only thing that we found, the only thing that was statistically significant was when we compared people whose economic situation in the past 12 months got worse and those whose economic situation got better or stayed the same in the past 12 months. So the differences between the way these two groups answer the question, are you worried about legal immigration, shows a little bit of increased worry among those whose economic situation got worse for answering a question about legal immigration or worries about legal immigration. So this was statistically significant in all countries except for the United States, which you see on the left-hand side, and it seems that there wasn't much of an effect there. What we did find was a huge effect, or what was a huge correlation, was political affiliation, self-described political affiliation, and attitudes towards immigration. So is immigration more of a problem or more of an opportunity? We found that both last year and this year that, of course, this is highly correlated with how people describe themselves, whether they're on the right or the left in Europe and Canada, or if they're Democrat, Republican, or independent in the United States. And what's interesting is that, of course, you still see the upslope this year. But what you see is a greater disparity between the people on the right and the people on the left answering this question this year compared to last year. So it seems that this issue is increasingly polarized, with a big jump in especially Republicans in the United States saying that immigration is more of a problem rather than an opportunity. Going on to the perception and reality gap between the perception of immigration and the reality. So we asked people, well, how many immigrants do you think there are in your country? Do you think there are too many, a lot but not too many, or not many? And as you see, we have a lot of cross-country difference here, with several countries on the left saying that there are too many immigrants, and others on the right side of the screen saying that there are a lot, but not too many. So we wanted to find out really, though, how many they thought were too many, especially in these countries that you see to the left-hand side of the screen. So we asked, out of every 100 people in the country, how many of them do you think were born in another country? Basically, the percentage of immigrants in your country. These are the numbers that we got from our respondents. And these are the actual numbers based on OECD data. So particularly for the United States, there's a 21 percentage point gap between the perception of how many immigrants there are and the reality of how many immigrants actually are in the country. Of course, this might be due to people including second-generation migrants when they answer this question, but nevertheless, it shows that there's a lot of room for education on this issue across all of these countries. So particularly in the United States, there's, of course, illegal immigration is one of the hot button issues whenever you're talking about this subject. So we wanted to see if there were wide differences in perception of illegal and legal immigration and these different immigrant groups. So this year we asked, are you worried about legal immigration? Are you worried about illegal immigration? And as you can see, there are big differences in this, in the results that we found. So in the United States, 61% are worried about illegal immigration, where a very small minority, 17%, are worried about legal. In Canada, where there's really not much of a discussion about illegal immigration at all, of course it's fairly difficult for illegal immigrants to get to Canada. Nevertheless, still 50% said that they were worried about illegal immigration. So it seems that this, as a concept and also as a phenomenon, is very worrying for a number of people in different countries. Getting at the perceptions of these two immigrant groups is, of course, something that we wanted to focus on in this year as well. So we asked, well, do you think legal and do you think illegal immigrants are hard workers? And this is all countries aggregated here. So yes, they're perceived to be hard workers, both groups, though legal immigrants are perceived to be a little bit more hardworking or more likely to be seen as hard workers. Legal immigrants, or illegal immigrants are still a big majority saying that they are hard workers. They're also perceived to help fill labor shortages where there are shortages of workers who are native born. Where we start to see the differences, though, are on issues like, do you think that these two groups of immigrants are a burden on social services like schools and hospitals? And we see that actually illegal immigrants are perceived to be a burden, whereas legal immigrants are perceived not to be so. Again, on whether these two groups increase crime in society, we found that illegal immigrants are much more likely to be cited as increasing crime, whereas legal immigrants are not perceived to increase crime. On the issue of increasing the likelihood of a terrorist attack, we actually found that neither group had majorities across countries saying that these immigrants increase the likelihood of a terrorist attack. So though, of course, every time that there is a terrorist attack, immigration usually enters the discussion in the media and the public discourse, it seems that the respondents in our survey are really not tying these issues as closely together as are the media and certain politicians. So immigration policy preferences, this is, as I said, really the meat of how countries should be managing immigration to their countries. And particularly for the United States, these questions that we asked in this section were of particular interest. As many of you know, Obama has promised that we will have comprehensive immigration reform in 2010. There's already a lot of movement on the Hill to pass legislation, or at least legislation has been introduced in the House. And so what we are likely to see over the next year is a discussion about comprehensive immigration reform, which widely is accepted to include a number of different things. It will, in some ways, change the stipulations as to who should be admitted. It will probably legalize a number of the estimated 11 to 12 million illegal immigrants in the country. It will also expand temporary worker programs, both for low and high-skilled workers. It will also punish employers who hire illegal immigrants and expand the use of the E-Verify system. And it will also continue to reinforce border controls. So in our survey, we essentially asked about all of these different issues. And of course, they're interesting in the United States, but we asked them across countries, and they're interesting there as well. So on the first thing, how to decide who should be admitted to the country. What is important for immigrants to have in order to be admitted? Should they know the national language? We found that people across both continents said that it's important to know the language. To have a job offer is also seen as being important. Being highly educated, which might be correlated as well, is also seen to be important across all countries, though a little bit less so. Having a family member already in the country, so essentially family reunification, is seen as important in Canada, where family reunification visas are alive and well. But in Europe and the United States, it seems that people are starting to back away from this option. And is it important for immigrants to come from a country with a Christian heritage is the question that we asked. And we actually found that in no country were there majorities saying that it's important for people to come from a Christian country in order to be admitted to their country. So kind of in a roundabout way, getting at possibly the issue of Muslim immigration, we found that there was no support for discriminating based on religion. Of course, as I mentioned, one of the hot button issues for comprehensive immigration reform will be legalizing illegal immigrants. And we asked, do you think that people should be legalized, or do you think that they should be made to return to their home country? And last year, what we found is that a plurality of Americans, so of the people that answered the question in the United States last year, 49%, this is a plurality of Americans, supported legalizing the illegal immigrant population. And in Europe, it didn't seem that we had majority support for this policy. In 2009, this is a slightly different story. So as you can see, there's an uptick in support for legalization across Europe. So in every country, though sometimes it's within the margin of error, there is an uptick in support for legalization of illegal immigrants. And in fact, Italy, where you see a big jump, they actually had a legalization measure in 2009 for domestic workers. But in the United States, where this will arguably be the most important issue in all of these countries, we actually saw a reduced level of support for this policy. Now a clear minority of the respondents in our survey supported legalizing illegal immigrants. So expanding temporary worker programs, as I mentioned, would probably also be part of comprehensive immigration reform. So we asked, well, of the new immigrants who come here to work, so we're specifying workers here, we said, do you think that they should be admitted permanently, or do you think that they should be admitted only temporarily and then be made to return to their country of origin? And last year, we found that there was majority support across all countries for admitting people permanently rather than temporarily. This is something that we saw again this year, and across Europe, these are actually remarkably stable numbers. So you see almost no change at all, or change within the margin of error for the level of support of this policy. The only place where we saw the change, of course, is in the United States, where it now looks like we have 70% of the respondents who would prefer that people be admitted permanently. So when we talk about expanding temporary worker programs, this might be something to keep in mind. Now, certainly with illegal immigration, with legalizing potentially illegal immigrants already in the country, it often has to come with the political compromise of increasing enforcement efforts. So we asked a number of questions about what we could do to reduce illegal immigration to these various countries. So are you in support of reinforcing border controls? Found that yes, people are in favor of this. Should we punish employers who hire illegal immigrants? We found yes, people are also in favor of this. They're also in favor of increasing development aid, except in the United States where we only have 50%. This might be also due to Americans' general perception of development aid, but nevertheless, it finds a plurality support. And then, of course, the more proactive policy of making it easier to legally enter the country to work or to study also finds broad support in the countries that we surveyed. So these numbers in this graph that you see is essentially what we saw last year as well. So people are broadly in support of policies to reduce illegal immigration to their country, which of course is interesting, but we also wanted to delve deeper into this question this year. So after asking these 4 questions, we asked them, okay, so what do you think is going to be the most effective way of reducing illegal immigration to your country? And this is where we start to see some really interesting differences. So increasing development aid to the country is something that was favored by a large plurality or even a majority in Spain. So if you'll notice, France, Italy, and Spain are the countries that would prefer increasing development aid. They're also the countries in our survey that are bordering the Mediterranean. So as we go forward with Mediterranean Union talks, this is certainly interesting. Reinforcing border controls is actually something that was very clearly favored in the UK, where, of course, people still have to show their passports when they enter the UK, as it is not part of the Schengen area. So Europeans still have to show their passports when they enter, and it seems that the British respondents here would prefer that that be kept in place. Employer sanctions seem to have been favored in the Netherlands and in Germany. so punishing employers who hire illegal immigrants. But all the way to the left of the side of the screen, I think it's pretty clear that, at least in the United States and Canada, there's no clear way that people think is going to be the most effective to reduce illegal immigration. So perhaps, maybe with the exception of development aid in the United States, that we should have a multifaceted approach to the reduction of illegal immigration to the country in the future. A couple of questions about immigrant integration. I know, especially in New York, with such a diverse immigrant population, this is certainly an issue to explore. So we asked people, well, do you think that legal immigrants should have the same rights to social benefits that citizens enjoy? And we found that across all countries, we had at least 50% who supported this policy of giving social benefits to legal migrants. The only country that was clearly split on this was the UK, where actually when they opened their borders in 2004 to the new member states of the EU, restricted access to social benefits for 2 years. So people had to come, work for 2 years, and then were able to be eligible for social benefits. So it seems that this restrictive model of social benefits for immigrants is something that continues to have support in the UK. Something that might be interesting for Demos is local voting rights for legal immigrants. So whether they should have the right to vote in local government elections. And we see a lot of cross-country difference here, though in Spain and Italy, it seems that, that people think that they should be able to vote in local government elections, where in the United States it's very clear that people would prefer that these rights be restricted to citizens only. Considering the fact that it's relatively easy to naturalize in the United States, it seems that people think that people should become citizens first before having the right to vote. This year we asked a new question as well, something that's kind of in the minds of people who work on integration topics, who often talk about a two-way street of immigrant integration. So we asked, well, what do you think is the greatest barrier to integration? Is it immigrants' unwillingness to integrate, or is it actually the discrimination that they face from society? So when we asked this question, we saw, again, a lot of cross-country difference here with well, it seems that the Americans in our survey were fairly split on this, but in other countries, especially to the right of the screen, it seems that respondents are fairly clear that it's actually the unwillingness of immigrants to integrate if there is indeed a barrier to integration. Delving a little deeper into this question to see why people answered it the way that they did, we also cross-tabbed this with another question that we have about how many, if any, immigrant friends our respondent had. So do you have many, several friends, a few, or no immigrant friends? And as you can see, essentially the fewer immigrant friends that you have, the more likely you are to say that it's immigrants' unwillingness to integrate that is the greatest barrier. Some have interpreted this to mean that those who ostensibly are discriminating against immigrants by not interacting with them are actually the ones who say it's the immigrants who are unwilling, though that's one interpretation, not one that I would put my weight behind. So government's evaluation and decision making, this is really how people are grading their governments, how they think immigration policy decisions should be made. So we asked, well, do you think your government currently is doing a good, fair, poor, or very poor job at immigration management? And as you can see, there are some big differences here. So all the way to the left of the screen, Germany, 71% of Germans said that their government is doing either a good or a fair job at immigration management. Of course, the German government was very happy about this, to hear that they have the support of their citizens. But this essentially includes a very restrictive immigration policy with a very proactive integration policy. So, so we're not, the Germans actually aren't admitting many people to the country as the United States and Canada are, for instance. On the UK side, we see that it's essentially the exact opposite situation, with 71% who are unhappy with the way that the government is currently handling migration, even though they've just introduced a new system to essentially admit people based on a points system. So people who have higher education, a job offer, are now essentially fast-tracked to get into the UK. It seems that people, or the British respondents, are still dissatisfied with the way it's being handled. On the the U.S. government assessment of immigrant management or immigration management, we found that there was, again, a lot of difference between the people who assign themselves to various political parties. So Republicans are much more likely to say that the government is doing a poor job on immigration management, though I'd like to point out that there are actually majorities across all political parties saying that the government is doing a poor job. Then we asked, well, immigration policy decisions, at what level do you think that these things should be decided? Should they be at the state, regional, local level, the national government level, or in Europe, the EU level? So what we found is that the European average is to hand these responsibilities over to the European Union in Brussels. So actually, as of December 1st of last year, the Lisbon Treaty came into force, which means that the European Union now has broad powers to control illegal immigration to the continent. So that's largely in their hands. They're also in charge of ensuring certain standards of treatment of third country nationals across the EU, though individual countries can still determine who comes in and what their qualifications should be. But it seems that they're going more in the direction of EU management of immigration. Of course, this is a different story in the UK, which is traditionally skeptical of the EU managing anything. So the British respondents here would prefer that the British government be making immigration policy decisions. And in the United States, we find that the state or local level versus the national government level, it's very clear that people are still looking to Washington to lead on this issue, which is encouraging considering the massive effort that comprehensive immigration reform will take. Now, just a very quick note, the German Marshall Fund has started a study team on climate-induced migration, which studies both slow and sudden onset events in certain countries that would induce people to migrate across international borders. So we wanted to ask this question in our survey, of course, given our freedom of choice here. And so we asked, well, people who are displaced by things like sea level rise and more frequent droughts, we actually specified these two things. Do you think that people who are displaced from their homes because of these phenomena should be admitted to your country or allowed to settle in your country? And of course, this is probably the first time that almost all of our respondents had even heard of something like climate-induced migration, but it's nevertheless interesting to see their kind of knee-jerk reaction as to whether their country should admit these kinds of migrants. And it seems that across all countries, we see majorities in favor of letting these people settle. Just a quick wrap-up on economics and politics. It seems that the economic crisis has not had much of an effect on attitudes towards immigration yet, but that political affiliation or leaning seems to be very closely tied with perceptions of immigration. People are also grossly overestimating the numbers of immigrants in their countries versus the reality of the situation. On policy preferences, it seems that the support for permanent over temporary worker programs continues to have support across all countries. And in terms of legalizing illegal immigrants, there's support or increased support in Europe, though the support is down in the United States. And on government ratings, it seems that Americans across all political parties say that the government is currently doing a poor job or a very poor job on immigration management. Thank you for your attention, and I'll turn it back over to Bill.
Thank you very much, Delancey. There's a lot of food for thought there, and we look forward to getting to questions. But first, we'd like to hear from Michelle, who's an expert in her own right on this subject, and look forward to your views.
Great, thanks, Bill and Delancey. It's just so interesting. I love this study when it came out the first time last year, and it just kind of gets more and more and more interesting. There's a couple of thoughts going through there. The first is actually on Poland. I was kind of disappointed to see Poland's not in. I know you said you guys were having trouble getting respondents, but I was in Poland this June at a migration conference in Warsaw, which was particularly interesting because I had been there about 3 years earlier, also at migration conference. And at the first conference, they were talking about sort of Eastern European and some Chinese and Vietnamese, but they weren't even calling them immigrants in Poland. They had sort of like refugee housing, temporary housing. And they said, oh, well, they're not going to stay here. And they didn't even seem to be part of the question. And in the rest of Europe, you'll hear people in all sorts of countries saying, well, are we an immigration nation or not? Are we a country of immigration or not? And there's a big debate over this. They weren't even asking that question in Poland 3 years ago, but when I was there last June, people in Poland, of all places, were saying, hey, we're an immigration nation. Now, granted, this was a sort of, elite academic kind of crowd, people who follow this kind of stuff, but I was really amazed at that sea change. So maybe people will change their minds about answering questions in Poland. Also, your comment on support for environmental or climate migrants was very, very telling, because the last couple of weeks I've been spending a lot of time talking about the situation in Haiti. We've seen some attitudes towards immigration from Haiti to the United States changing a lot, specifically regarding the earthquake. But it's very interesting that in 2008 you had 4 major storms, three hurricanes go through Haiti, destroying a lot of the crops and the livestock. And I think those were very, very clearly climate change related desires to emigrate, because the rising temperature of the sea level the rising temperature of the sea is making it more and more violent when there are storms. And Haiti is bearing the brunt of that, even though it has contributed infinitesimal part of global greenhouse gases. And at that time, nobody was really thinking in those terms. So I'm really interested to see what happens with this bit of information, that there is such strong support for finding homes for climate refugees. I think that's a real positive in this study. A couple of other things that struck me, and a lot of it has to do with this gap between perception and reality that you talked about, particularly when you're looking at the difference between the actual numbers of immigrants in a country and the perception of the numbers. It's clear that people are not getting something. On crime, I'm very interested. It would be interesting to see a layer added into this study on the perceptions of the level of crime among immigrants and reality of it. I know one study I cite a lot has to do with Mexican men between ages 18 and I think 35, and actually the propensity for violent crime among that group is 1/7 the level of American men in that group. Also, the skew between perceptions of legal immigrants being more likely to be involved in crime and illegal immigrants, I think that there's a little bit of a tension in there that I'm not sure how you could tease out with your questions, in that for some people, when they say crime, they see illegal immigration as a crime in and of itself. Technically it's a civil offense, it's not a criminal offense. I'm sure that there are some people who do think that illegal immigrants are more likely to commit crimes. The reality, just as in other places, is quite different from that. Another area that I thought was fascinating was the fall in support for legalizing immigrants. The response to this depends tremendously on how you ask that question. And we've seen some other poll data from other organizations in the United States over the course of the past year that's been somewhat contradictory. In 2007, when the Senate was debating a lot of this, I was very, very closely following the polls. It seems like every week we had another one. And at that time, you had actually pretty consistent majorities, 2/3. There was one poll that had 78% in favor of legalization. And I actually debated a lot of this on MSNBC at the time. And I remember pointing out these statistics in a debate with Patrick Buchanan, who turned around and says, well, you're fixing those polls, which I took to be a great vote of confidence. If only I had that power. But what's interesting about that was that in 2007, of course, that bill failed. I mean, it was a bill that started out with some good things in it, and they put so many bad things in it to appease the people who opposed it, who were never going to change their mind, that they talked the people who were in favor of it out of supporting it. But interestingly, this past spring and early summer, there were a number of other polls that showed that support had actually gone up for legalization. There had been one poll in 2007, it was an ABC News poll, that was one in the minority that did not show support for legalization. I think it was only 49% in favor in 2007. This past spring, it showed 61% in support. But there also was a Gallup poll that came out that had results similar sort of in tone to what Delancey has reported. And this is a question that Gallup asks repeatedly, and it's been going back for decades. And it's basically, do you want more immigration, less immigration, or about the same? And it's this kind of very rough proxy for attitudes. And last year, interestingly, the number who said that immigration should be decreased rose significantly from 39% to 50%. So that would be consistent with these questions. But there was yet another poll. I think it was Pew in 2007 showed 58% in favor of legalization. 2009 up to 63%. And then the Benison Strategy Group that did a poll last year for America's Voice, when they asked people if they were in favor or against comprehensive immigration reform, you had total support from 64%, total opposition from 21%. And then they went and they changed the question a little bit. And they said, are you in favor of comprehensive reform that would secure the border, crack down on employers who hire illegal immigrants, require illegal immigrants to register for legal status, pay back taxes, and learn English if they want to be eligible for U.S. citizenship? For that, 86% had total support for Congress passing it, and only 14% totally opposed it. There's been a lot of focus grouping and that kind of stuff going on among immigration advocates. And they found that there's much stronger support for a what they call a sort of earned legalization. If you add some, sort of tough guy, beat him about the head and shoulders language, then they're much more likely to support it. So I'd be very interesting to see perhaps a testing of a couple of different ways of asking that question. Going back to the perception versus reality, you're looking at whether people thought it was the immigrants who didn't want to integrate or if it was a problem with society, and how related that was to whether people came into regular contact with immigrants was also telling. I think information has a lot to do with this. There's a sort of a cartoon that ran in 2006 when you had the Minutemen vigilantes along the border in the United States, and they had a guy in a beer belly in his lawn chair with a beer popped open, sitting and watching for people running across the border. And then there's a little guy running across, and he says, "Oh, let him go. He's my gardener. He's okay." And I think that shows that when there is personal contact, some of these feelings of fear dissipate. And certainly, Robert Putnam's work on bowling alone on diverse communities has borne out some of that. And then a story that I keep coming back to comes from when I was doing the reporting for my book Lockout about U.S. immigration policy. And they were having a meeting out on Long Island in Babylon of the Minutemen. They were recruiting people to go sit in lawn chairs on the Canadian border. And when I went out there were all these people, up in arms or protests back and forth. And I was talking to one Minuteman who was, a couple minutes earlier, he'd been screaming at people in the audience. I mean, it was not in the audience, protesters in front of the building. And he said, "Oh, these immigrants, they don't want to learn English. They're terrible, blah, blah, blah." I said, "Well, did you know that in New York City, there's a waiting list of more than 1 million people who want to get into English classes? And that's actually consistent with a lot of the big cities across the country." And this guy, a Minuteman, no less, said, "Really? Wow. I'm really glad to hear that." And so I think it speaks to the power of information in changing some of those attitudes. So I'm very, very glad you included the bit about how people's contact with immigrants affects their ideas. On this, the question of permanent versus temporary preferences, last year I remember that standing out as one of the very, very important findings in the poll, and I took that into consideration very heavily. Delancey was nice enough to send over a big pile of last year's studies to a group that I was meeting with. It was organized by the Brookings Institution and Duke University. They got a group of about 25 people in a room, as diverse in opinion as you can get without them stabbing each other by being in the same room. But it was this far, let me tell you. We met over the course of a year, trying to figure out what we could agree on and what we could agree to disagree on, because it was really quite contentious. But that finding was something we really took very, very seriously in the report that we came out with last fall on breaking the immigration stalemate. And it strikes me that the 2007 legislation failed in large part not because of the conventional wisdom that it was amnesty and people just couldn't swallow that, but because of this question of temporary versus permanent. A lot of the real political calculus was done at the union level. There was a real break among the different unions over what to do about the bill. It originally had been intended to increase the allowances for legal immigration. And the bill that came out in the end basically included a very, very large number of just temporary guest worker visas, which was just a rollickingly bad idea. And that's what caused the unions to break ranks on this and say, hey, we can't accept that. And I think that's a lot of why the 2007 bill failed. And I think it's something that the Obama administration should take into account very, very clearly when it's ready to propose new comprehensive immigration reform. Americans show a lot of concern over whether immigrants are going to integrate or not. And for them to be able to immigrate, we've got to have a legal system and structures that not only encourage that, but in our case, it's often a question of whether you allow it or not, because we've got so many illegal immigrants in this country, which has been created by a system that doesn't allow enough paths to legal status and certainly not to citizenship. We've kind of created our own problem. So I think that insight again is a huge contribution that this research has done, and I'll certainly try to get the word out there more. So those are my thoughts on some of the highlights, the points of what Delancey has laid out for us.
But Canadians, they seem to be very open to immigration, and the interesting case in Canada, which I think is something for Americans to learn from, is the fact that they have this provincial nomination program. So actually, provinces can nominate the kinds of immigrants that they want to come to their territory. So there's been this policy in Manitoba, for instance, where they're importing a lot of very low-skilled workers to work in kind of meatpacking industries. But then when they come, they're then eventually given permanent residency in Canada and can go wherever they want. So it's kind of this interesting policy, which we certainly don't have anything like that in the United States, where states can actually determine what kind of migrants are coming to their territory. Though it's kind of interesting because local economies are very different and they require very different kinds of workers. So it's certainly an interesting model, and I think that Canada, considering the fact that it's been taking in so many migrants but has such an innovative policy, or very innovative policies, I think is something that's interesting. The Canadians seem to be very optimistic about immigration in general. How they're currently rating their government, there's going to be some big changes coming up. So there's actually going to be kind of a revamped citizenship test, and it'll actually try to define more clearly what a Canadian is. So apparently the new citizenship booklet will say things like, well, Canadians volunteer, they recycle, This is like, these are what define someone as a Canadian. But of course, this hasn't been part of the history and tradition of Canada in the past, and so they're going to be almost taking a German model, actually, of saying like, oh, well, what is it to be German, and kind of saying like, well, if you want to immigrate to Canada, if you want to become a citizen of Canada, you kind of have to espouse these values. So, which is interesting because there have been mixed results with the German case and other European countries that have taken that track. So, on France and also Germany, we've certainly considered the fact that many of our respondents are answering in a politically correct way, or what they consider to be politically correct. And this is the case for all kind of public opinion studies, where you never know how much political correctness plays a factor. But I think what's interesting is that, on general issues of is immigration more of a problem or opportunity, you get a certain answer. But on very specific issues, it's harder to know what the politically correct answer is, I think. And so when we get down to the very nitty-gritty, so like do illegal immigrants increase crime in society, for instance? I mean, I think it would be very politically correct to say, like, okay, illegal immigrants do increase crime in society, but actually in France, we see very low numbers. I mean, less than a third of the French think that illegal immigrants increase crime in society, which I think is fascinating. But on something like that, I would suspect that political correctness plays less of a role, though of course you can never be sure, but that's something definitely that we keep in mind when we're analyzing this data. Thanks.
It would be very interesting to see if this country, in talking about legalization, said, okay, here's a community, this community can nominate people. We've certainly seen that on a much more informal basis when we've seen in California, in Queens, where somebody very popular, very important part of the community, when the feds go after them, the community gets together and calls their congressman and says, hey, get a waiver for this person to stay. So I think it would be an interesting experiment. In Canada, I think some of the disillusionment with the system has to do with the fact that first of all, there's a big backlog on the points system. There's still a lot of people waiting to come in, but also you get the sort of stereotypical neurosurgeon driving a taxi in Canada, that it's not connected to whether or not somebody has a job. You can have whatever set of criteria, but it's sort of set up at the top without a real relationship to what's going on. And as far as the citizenship tests, I thought it was very interesting to see the process as Germany started creating those tests. I've heard some very strong criticisms from Turkish Germans, actually, in the conference that the World Policy Institute did with the German Marshall Fund and the Heinrich Böll Stiftung in Berlin in 2006. Cem Özdemir really strongly criticized a question on one of the tests. They were at the state level at the time. I think it was a question like, which soccer team would you vote for? would you root for? And then when I was in Berlin more recently, a Turkish member of the sort of Berlin legislative body said that there was a question about, if you go to the store and you buy a television and it doesn't work, what do you do? And that's a question on the citizenship tests. And so hopefully, Canada will take the good and not the bizarre from the German example.
And the questions where there's possibly a lack of opinion, or we're gauging non-opinion, essentially, especially in the question that I presented about climate-induced migration. I mean, I kind of tried to allude to this. I think that people probably haven't heard of this before, ever. And, so them answering this question is just kind of a knee-jerk reaction. They might have humanitarian concerns that they answer the question a certain way, and we're certainly sensitive to that. Though, and so there are certain questions, especially ones about, for instance, illegal immigration in Canada. I mean, when we got those kind of results from Canada where they don't really have illegal immigration, what do you do with those results? I mean, how do you interpret those results? So certainly there are questions in our survey our priority is to keep the questionnaire the same across all countries so that we can really compare them. But certainly there are some questions that are more pertinent in certain countries than they are in others. So on questions of illegal immigration in the United States, I think we're actually gauging opinion, and we're not necessarily gauging non-opinion. The purpose of the survey is to reach out to a number of different audiences, and one of our primary audiences is government officials. So as part of the primary rollout activities of this survey, I briefed people at the United States Citizenship and Immigration Services, the State Department's Population, Refugee, and Migration Division, and the Department of Labor. We've done a number of briefings for Canadian and Canadian immigration officials, the Interior Ministry in Germany, Home Office in the UK. I mean, we're really trying to get these results out to policymakers and to make sure that they're taken into account when they actually form policy.
You tell me that they're ignoring legislators?
Actually, and I just last week I actually did an event on the Hill for congressional staffers as well, and I'll be going to the European Parliament next week. So on the question of employment, though, certainly we have unemployment like we haven't seen in decades, especially in this country, but in other countries as well. And I think that at least on employment, certainly there are sectors of the economy that are always going to be filled by immigrant labor, or for the foreseeable future. So things like agriculture, construction, IT and engineering on the high-end side, I think are going to need immigrant labor regardless of the numbers that we see coming out of the unemployment statistics. So that would be my comment on that. On the illegal and undocumented question, certainly we realize the sensitivity of the term illegal immigrant and are sensitive to it. But when we were designing this survey and certainly considered this issue, we wanted to make sure that the concept that we were talking about would be understandable to our respondents. So in a number of countries, actually, immigrants who are undocumented are referred to undocumented or irregular migrants. But the term illegal immigrant, we decided to keep the questionnaire uniform, would be a concept that would be understood across all countries. And so we wanted, our priority was to gauge opinion. And while we realized that it's not the most politically correct term to use in general discourse, it was the one that we used in the survey for that reason. We didn't want to necessarily have questions in our questionnaire that would make headlines, but that wouldn't be useful for the debate. So we really tried to focus on policy preferences rather than perceptions of different groups, because it's not useful for anyone to figure out which country is the most racist, essentially. Language questions. So we actually asked questions about language courses both this year and last year. And last year the question was, do you support do you support free language classes for legal immigrants and their families? And people overwhelmingly supported this. So considering that we got about 90% in all countries saying that they supported free national language classes for immigrants, we thought, well, okay, this year we'll ask a question like, well, do you think that the government should be paying for national language classes for immigrants, or do you think that it's not the responsibility of the government to be paying for these? And this year we had much different results. So we actually, so I think only in Canada, I think we had something like 48%, but still a minority who would support government-sponsored language classes, but in all other countries, majorities did not want the government to be paying for those.
You are watching Delancey Gustin and Michelle Wucker. And the name of the talk?
English acquisition, and it's always, way up the top. The immigrants absolutely feel that English is important. When you look at some of the language acquisition data, when you go down to the second and certainly the third generation, it's a very, very strong English acquisition. And I actually have an issue with the idea of success being that you only speak one language. When my mother was a little girl, she was not allowed to speak French with her mother, who was from Belgium, because it was rude to speak a foreign language in front of other people. And then when she went to college, by then you had the United Nations, and there was the idea that you could get a job out of this. And so the Migration Policy Group did a big study, an immigrant integration index, that was Canada and Europe. And I think Canada was very, very upset that they did not come out higher and rosier on that index than they actually did. So I think Canada's a fascinating case. I'm really glad you included it.
All right, let's take a couple more questions. Right here, you had your hand up earlier, and then Herb, and then we'll come close. Well, wait a minute. I'm sorry, the gentleman behind you, and we've got a lot of questions. We're going to try to squeeze all of them in the next minutes.
Immigration has two components.
Introduce yourself.
My name is Govind Singh. I'm from Merrill Lynch, but I'm speaking for myself. There are two components in immigration. One is the country who receives it and the people who come to that country. And the policies of these countries is based on their own need, labor force, economically, their need for the people to come and help them. Now, Delancey's study was done to the populace. Populace participated and expressed their opinion. Have you done or do you plan to do any study on the policies of these countries and how much they are matched? Thank you.
You mean of the origin countries?
Correct, those who receive.
Okay, fine. And then Rob?
I have a follow-up.
Just take the microphone and introduce yourself.
Rob Houck, I'm a lawyer here in New York. My question is very similar, and it's not really fair because we know you focused on the countries to which these immigrants came. But my question is, to what extent do the policies of the home countries hinder or encourage integration of the immigrants? And I could go on. I've got a bunch of other related questions, but that's basically the core of all of them.
All right. So that's sort of one question. Klaus, go ahead.
Klaus Müller, it's related to what he said, but it's a different group. Do you do research at all or collect data? What the migrants and immigrants had to say about discrimination and integration? Because that's the other side, which is totally lacking in discourse here.
Okay, good.
Sure. So, unfortunately, we didn't survey any countries who are sending migrants, though, it might be something that we consider in the future. But for now, we like to keep
the policies of the country receiving their policy because people respond to those policies.
So the immigrants you're saying that are in the receiving country, or?
Immigrants who come to those countries, who discuss there. There is a policy in those countries who would like to immigrants to come.
Mm-hmm. Oh, okay. Yeah. Great. So, I think that when we talk about the different policies that countries have to integrate migrants or how welcoming they are, I think it affects migration patterns, but in different ways. So I think, obviously, for low-skilled migrants who tend to be poorer from poorer countries, of course, they're making their decisions mostly based on geography. So, of course, Mexicans coming or Central Americans coming to the United States makes a lot of sense, and of course, Middle Easterners and Turkish people, for instance, coming to Europe. So, for low-skilled migrants, I think geography is really the most important factor. For high-skilled migrants, it's a very different story. So, Europe has been in continuing discussions about how to attract high-skilled migrants. And in general, they, want to be competitive in the world market for especially people that are working in IT or engineering, because those are highly competitive fields where professionals are scarce. But the policies that they've tried to put forth have not been very attractive to these kind of migrants.